to listen to. I'm going to have to dip out in a moment anyway.
Perfect. Cool. That was a good introduction because all the news was all to do with Teams. So that's perfect. But in all seriousness, it's kind of interesting, and it's kind of interesting to watch the Microsoft direction at the moment. A lot of it is towards Teams, and they're putting a lot of bets on Teams. And the other, there's that, but also the other interesting thing that's happened in my world in the last 6 to 12 months is that Microsoft have suddenly realized that the development platform for Teams is actually quite important, because, and it's always sort of been there, but it's, you know, it's kind of ebbed and flowed in terms of importance. But I think Microsoft have figured out that actually, if you can bring workloads into Teams where users are, that's really valuable. And that's keeping people inside Teams, and it's keeping people using Teams to get their work done. And so we've seen like a real emphasis in the last 6 months actually in how things have changed, and how more and more things are being kind of opened up and brought into Teams. So that's really good and exciting on one side, and that's good stuff about technology, keeps it exciting and keeps it changing. It does mean that the landscape gets a little bit more complex all the time, so there's now lots of different places to look. But you know, building apps on Teams is it's interesting, it's exciting, and it's not as complicated as you might think necessarily. There's definitely kind of things you could do to make it easier, and there's lots of entry points as well. I'm just going to show you something really quickly. This was actually built by Holly, who was a 15-year-old work experience student we had last year, who wrote a bot to run in Teams to run the like the music, the hi-fi thing we've got in our office. So you can just she built this in 2.5 days. You can see what's playing, you can search Spotify catalog, just all APIs under the hood. But she did this in 2.5 days from nothing, 15 years old. It's pretty incredible, really, but it kind of just shows you the kind of things that you can do and what's possible, and how to really just bring a lot of these workloads into Teams and just empower users really to get going. So let's start off really high level. So I said it was easy, but lots of different places you could go. There's really 3 key areas. I'm going to go through each one of these. There's the UI of Teams, so controlling the UI, and some of those things we've already mentioned in the news. So things like the messaging extensions, and I'll come into those in a minute and show you what that is, in case, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Bots, massive topic. Everybody wants to build bots. Everybody wants to have a bot. That's a thing. And then also Microsoft Graph as a kind of development surface, as a way you can work with Teams. So those are the 3 key areas I'm going to go through, and then at the end I'm going to just touch on something that might be interesting and useful and brings it all together as well. So looking at the Teams UI and experience, what do I mean by that? It's all the places inside the Teams client really that are opened up for developers to work with. So it's tabs, the most classic obvious thing you think of, but messaging extensions as well. That breaks down into lots of little things as well, so you can get really granular. So like link unfurling, so that's the thing when you put a link in and it breaks it open and gives you the nice title with a little picture and everything like that. You can make your own ones of those. So if you've got internal URLs in your organization, or that link to a CRM system or something legacy and bespoke, you could write your own link unfurling. So when people put links in from those internal URLs, you get a really nice preview. Those are things you can do. Task modules, we've already talked about, the dialog pop-ups, lots of control over the user interface in Teams. One of the nice things about how all this is structured, if you've been doing this for a while, so I've come from doing Microsoft Link development, Skype for Business development into this world, this is very much a controlled experience in the UI. And if you build for a messaging extension, if you build a task module, the way it looks and feels is fairly similar across all devices and mobile. You don't have to try and build the same thing again and again for different devices. You build it once and it works. That's very different from where we were in, let's say, Skype for Business, where you could write a client application really easily because there was a great Windows-based client SDK, fantastic. Nothing for mobile, nothing for Mac, nothing for Linux. Like, so the experience was very fractured. This is different in, oh, something sounded like Siri, I don't know what it was. Right. The experience here is different in that you're writing for the web essentially, because that's all the Teams client is at the end of the day, but you write against it once and then it works the same everywhere. So pros and cons, just something to be aware of. The other thing is that actually bots come into this as well, because you don't have to just use one of these things. You can combine them to make a really rich experience. So you could have a bot that is also a tab, that is also a messaging extension, and combine everything all together in one go. And then also there's the Teams client SDK, which is I'll touch on a bit later. It's a kind of rich framework for making a lot of the kind of complicated bits about making a web page work with Teams nice and easy. So it's all like, it's a nice JavaScript package, npm package that handles like the login nicely, that gets you all the information you need about the team and stuff like that. Just makes the whole thing a little bit easier. Okay, so two things I'm going to show you real quick, and this should be fine. So I'm doing this whole presentation on a laptop, not on my normal kind of monitor setups, just because of being banished, but I'm pretty sure I can just go, right, perfect. So I want to really quickly show you a messaging extension, just in case you've never seen one before, or even if you have, and now you know what its proper name is, because I think they're massively underused and really valuable for especially surfacing information from maybe legacy systems, third-party systems, stuff like that. So let's say you've got one of those. Let's say you've got a stock management system that lists your product catalog, something in your company. All your staff spend all day in Teams talking about different things, and they're constantly referencing product codes. And if you don't know what those product codes are because you're new, it's kind of annoying to keep flipping back to the database to go and look up all these different product codes, right? So down here, this is a messaging extension. They live down here in the bit where you add your pictures and GIFs and emoji and all the rest of it. You can put your own thing down here. This is a search command one, so I can put a product code in here and it will look it up against my product catalog. And this product catalog is dynamically randomly generated with pictures of cats, but you get the idea. You can choose off your product catalog for whatever it is. You can put whatever you want in here. So I've pulled some fictitious stock information. I can choose it. It will make a really nice card that I can drop into the conversation to reference this conversation we're now having about shelf prints. And I can also, like, it'll magically include like a button to my CMS, whatever, right? So kind of super simple example, but it shows you what you can do and, you know, what's possible. And those messaging extensions are, like, I think they're really valuable for just getting information into Teams and keeping users on the same page in the discussions they're having. Okay, other thing I want to show you is relatively new, like, I don't know, a couple of months maybe, if that, and it's a new toolkit for Visual Studio Code. So apologies if you've already seen this, especially if you already had it demoed, but if you've only just come across it in news, maybe like this will be interesting. So this is for VS Code. It is coming for big Visual Studio, but right now it's just VS Code. And it's a Teams toolkit. So it's basically, the point is, like, the idea is it accelerates you your first few, like, it's scaffolding for your Teams application, right? It's really, I think it's really kind of nice. So you install it as an extension. It shows up here inside VS Code. A couple of things. So first of all, there's a nice landing page with some, if you've never done it before, really useful sort of gotcha avoiders. Basically, you can go through and it'll do all the things that you normally get wrong the first time you build a Teams app. So it'll sort your development, you know, go through and tell you how to do your developer account, sort out custom apps before you start, sort out Ngrok, because that's really useful to have, and all these other things. Basically, this is a kind of a one-stop shop for getting started. The other thing you can do is go create a new Teams app and choose where you want to put it. And now, literally, I can choose, do I want a tab? Do I want a bot? Do I want a messaging extension? And it'll do scaffolding for each of those things. So I can say, I don't know, I want a tab and I want a messaging extension. Fine. configure my tab. It's a personal tab. Configure my resting extension. What's it going to be? Let's say it's a search-based one rather than action-based one. Let's just say create a new bot. I'm going to have to log in probably. This is probably a terrible idea. Might be all right. And I can create a new one of these, and it's going to go and create some scaffolding for me to. Oh, really? Never mind. That's whatever. It's going to create some scaffolding for me if I can convince it to actually do something. Let's just do a tab, just so you can see. A brand new project. The thing I like about this actually is that when it creates it, it doesn't fill it full of like all the sample demo code that you often get with like Microsoft samples. It is the bare minimum you need to go and create your tab. So it's nothing you don't need. Like this is the only bit you will delete to get back to almost nothing, but it's also put in all the stuff you absolutely do need. It's also created a Microsoft Teams app manifest and the zip file that contains the app manifest app. So you can now take this directly into Microsoft Teams and run it. So I think this is really good for getting started, because this is, you could delete that line of code, the congratulations line, and get started building something pretty much straight away, and you've got everything else you need to kind of drop it straight into Teams and get started, which before this was a bit of a pain. Yeah, there were a bunch of steps you had to understand and go through around like sorting out that manifest, registering the application, and doing all that stuff just to get it up and running in Teams and seeing it in Teams, which once you start using the Teams SDK, you kind of need to have it running in Teams, because that the SDK is pulling information from Teams. It gets way harder to run it just standalone. So I think this is really cool. I think it's worth looking at if you're going to start building things like meshing extensions, things like the task modules and everything like that in Teams and tabs and stuff like that, because this makes it nice and easy.
Tom, we've got a hand up.
Sure.
Macaulay.
Oh yeah, cool.
Yeah, cheers, Gary. Hi, Tom. Thanks.
Hey.
I just wanted to ask: is it possible to do a local as you're developing locally, to run it in Teams and see live the changes?
Yes, it is.
Nice and easy with the extension, I imagine.
Yeah, it is. You use Ngrok is the answer. So
Okay,
Ngrok
cool.
is. Let's see if I can find it. Let's go here. So Ngrok is like HTTP tunneling thing. You run it as like a command line. It connects. It basically gives you an HTTP address that is public facing, and that routes through to your local HTTP on whatever port. So you set up your environment to run locally on like localhost 4567, but you can't make an app that does that, because Teams doesn't know what to do, because Teams is like this, big runs in the cloud thing. It has to work off public addresses. So that's where Ngrok comes in. Ngrok gives you like an HTTPS developer thing for the length of time you're running it. And then you can give that to Teams and say, here's my app in Teams, like go for it, like give it the Ngrok address, and you can do breakpointing and running in locally, sort of via Ngrok. So I'm just jumping here for a picture really. There's a blog post about it, but it kind of looks like this is the easiest example, right? To give you like, this is what it looks like when it's running. You get this HTTP address and it goes to your local host, and any connections you see kind of come down in the line here. Like there's way more you can do with Ngrok. It's quite powerful. It's pretty clever. Cool. But like that's the answer basically. Do that, set that up, and that's referenced actually in here. I come back here and here. I think Microsoft should basically buy Ngrok as a company, and I don't really know why they don't. But here you go. This is a good place to go as well. On the setup, install and set up Ngrok. They'll walk you. No, they won't. They'll just like tell you to download it. Yeah. This.
Okay, cool.
Here you go. Yeah. Anyway, the answer is yes. But Ngrok's the answer, but just like step through the documentation basically.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thanks for that.
Cool. Anyone else, just feel free to stop me. Otherwise, because I've only got one screen as well, so I can't see the chat or the hands. So just stop me. Cool. whilst we're talking about the UI experience for Teams, it is worth thinking a little bit about these apps that you're writing and how to write them, because it is a bit of a design decision. It's a bit of a slightly different way of thinking about it. Teams is supposed to be about collaboration, so don't make siloed apps. So think about building collaboration into your app. So think about surfacing information from your app in channels where people collectively can talk about it. Think about how you share information out. Make it user customizable as well. These are all things you can do relatively easily. Don't end up making an application that kind of puts users in a hole that they can't then get out of and they can't back up from. Try and make it an experience that they can share with others, and it kind of feeds that collaboration thing. Yeah, so like that's my only sort of advice really about like building these things. This is much of this is stolen from Microsoft slide actually, and their takeaway was don't be an app hole. So make of that what you will. Was not my joke, but yeah, that's the kind of the point. It's like don't make these apps that users get stuck into basically. And the other thing, and this is kind of going to be obvious to anyone who has built apps that fail in the past, just don't like talk to users. Like we were talking to this point a little bit earlier actually before we started, but just sit with your users, find out actually what it is they want. Don't try and boil the ocean and make a bot or an app that does every single thing. Like find out what the pain point is and solve for that first, and then think about coming back and adding things. I don't know, like just talk to users, understand. You don't need to be a designer, you just need to sit down with them and figure out what they're doing, and just find out like what it is that's important, and they will probably surprise you. Especially kind of these days, it's very different building apps for users, I think, than it used to be. The iteration loop is kind of much shorter, and it's much easier to kind of get their feedback quicker. Okay, so top level, the Teams UI. Bots. So that's another like massive area, obviously feeds into the UI as well, but the bots have just become a massive part of the story when it comes to collaboration at the moment, when it comes to sharing data, when it comes to apps and everything. And it sort of makes sense, right? Because if your users are in Teams or wherever, they want to stay in the same place. There's a interesting story. So I was told this by someone who was there called Albert, and it happened probably 30 years ago now, so 20 years ago, something like that, turn of the century, something like that, inside Microsoft. And Microsoft were looking at PBXs and looking at kind of how that voice over IP stuff was coming, and trying to figure out how to get into that market. And they were looking at all these other vendors, which were all hardware-based vendors, and they were trying to figure out whether they should build a hardware-based kind of voice solution. And Bill Gates at the time was kind of on that like design panel. They were presenting to him these different ideas. He didn't like any of them, kept asking like what the strategy was. And eventually he got so fed up and cross, he shouted at them, our strategy is software. And that is completely different from what was being done in hardware at the time, these hardware solutions. It led Microsoft to build a solution based around just common, Windows OS machines, servers machines, that became OCS, that became Link, that became Skype for Business, that became Teams. Having the software in the mix gave them this massive advantage. And the problem they solved in doing that was that common problem that it's still a problem today, depending on which office you go to, where you'll have people working at a computer and the phone rings and they swivel the desk and turn and pick up the telephone. And how, like, as soon as you do that, you lose the context of where people are at. You lose like so much in context switching. We see this same problem now on the desktop. Yes, all like the phones and stuff have all moved into soft phones and everything's moved onto the screen, and many people don't have a phone on the desk anymore, but context switching is still a massive problem. Making users go to several different places to go and get the information they need is a real problem. Teams is trying to solve that problem, but they can't do it alone. They need developers to help solve this problem, because data lives in lots of different places, right? It lives in third-party applications. It lives in actions that happen outside of the ecosystem. Lots of information is sitting in Microsoft 365, whether it's the information I worked on yesterday, the people I interacted with, my files, the other devices I've logged onto. All this information is useful. So bots can serve a really good way of going and getting all that information, presenting it back to users in a unified place. And if you're Microsoft, if all that can happen inside Teams, that's even better as well. And that's keeping users in what Microsoft like to call the OS for work. Like whether or not that, there is definite kind of productivity gains to be had by that, as well as it obviously being something Microsoft are probably quite keen users stay inside Teams. So bots in Teams kind of makes sense from that perspective, because it helps bring all that kind of disparate data into one place. Bots on Teams have been going for quite a long time relative to some of the other development surfaces. It's actually delivered now by the Azure Bot Service, kind of also sort of called the Bot Framework. This is, so put down Teams for a second and just kind of think across Azure, across Microsoft. The Bot Framework is a completely separate team inside Microsoft. They're not aligned to Microsoft Teams. They have this product, this surface, the Bot Framework, and the idea is that as a developer, you don't want to get involved in if you're building a bot, in the plumbing of how you talk to all the million different services that could host a bot. You want to write your bot in one place that's an abstraction, and then it magically work on all the different platforms. And that's what Bot Framework gives you. You write against the Bot Framework. Bot Framework then calls your code, and then sort of magic happens. The abstraction means that you can then just turn on your bot for a number of different channels. So things like Teams, Skype for Business, but also Slack, also SMS by Twilio. You can put it in email, you can embed it in a web page, lots and lots of different places. It's the same code. You don't have to write loads of different variants of your code. You can really quickly kind of switch it on. If that sounds interesting, news and interesting stuff from that team more recently. They just announced at Build, I want to say, they've just turned on 2 new channels for Amazon Alexa and Google Home. So what that meant was I had a bot already that worked across email, and I could literally go to the dashboard, tick Amazon Alexa, go through the setup steps to be an Amazon Alexa developer, trade API keys, and now that same bot works as something I can talk to in the living room, which is kind of the real power. It's pretty amazing, really. It's like that's the power of the bot framework in the middle. So why am I telling you all this? Well, the bot framework is that's the kind of methodology behind how you build bots in Teams. That's how you do it. It's the only way to do it, really. So if you want to build a bot in Microsoft Teams, you need to get familiar with bot framework. If you've never done this before, then this is the thing you should go and do first. So if you want to get started building bots and you've no idea where to go, I'm not going to go too far down this road because I'm a bit conscious of time, but let me show you where you should go. So let me come over here to Azure. So what you should do is go to your Azure subscription, create a new resource, go and create a new web app bot, because that's what it's called. Okay, do that. What this is going to do is create a bot framework bot for you. So I don't really care where I put it. I just want to show you down here under bot template. This bit here will create you some scaffolding. So it will create you a simple bot that echoes back what you say. Okay, so you can immediately try something out. There's loads of other things you can do here. There's scaffolding for making nice Q&A bots. There's scaffolding for like bringing into language understanding. But if you just want the very first one, do the Echo bot. I'm going to create it now. It's going to take a while. I just want to make sure it's definitely going to start creating. If we remember, we'll come back to it at the end, and I'll just kind of show you what it looks like. Or towards the end, you can tell me you've seen all this before and you don't care, and that's fine too. But if you've never done anything with bots, go try that first. That's a really good place because it will give you a bunch of code and something you can try like straight away. Evolution of the bot framework has been really interesting. So back in 2017, I used to do a 60-minute talk on building a weather bot. Like a simple bot you could talk to and say, what's the weather in London? What's the weather in New York? It would like call an API and give you back the weather. Kind of a bit silly, but also immensely powerful, because for every organization, being able to call an API and return data is something everybody needs to do, and everybody understands the weather. So it's a great kind of example demo. So in 2017, using the bot framework to do that was literally me sitting at the front for 60 minutes writing code. And it was pretty terrifying as well, because I couldn't really get anything wrong because the timings were so tight. And I'm not really sure how interesting it really was, because I was trying to talk and trying to code, and it wasn't great. You can see from the picture that someone took at the time, I had to bring my own keyboard to the conference just to like get the timings right and everything. So it was that much code. It was a bit ridiculous. Fast forward a year, that very same talk, that same session, that same bot, the same outcome, doing exactly the same thing, was a 30-minute session. So the time had been cut in half because of the investment the bot framework team made on getting it into Azure. That thing I just showed you about spinning up a bot, that didn't exist a year before. Now it does, and it was so much easier to get started. You didn't have to do all the setup stuff, and that immediately halved the time. Bring it forward to 2020 and announcements at, well, it was 2019 really, but announcements at Ignite, back end of Ignite. Actually, there's a visual UI for building bots now. It's called the Bot Framework Composer. It's drag and drop composable parts to build up a working bot. The really nice thing about this is that it's built kind of by developers for developers. It is not meant as a zero code solution. It's meant to get you up and running quickly. It is writing real bot code behind the scenes. And I've spoken to the PM about this because I know him quite well. Like, the whole intention was not to write like a zero code solution. The idea was just to make it easier for developers to talk to the business in understanding what their bots were doing and give them a springboard to get going quickly. It hasn't got a cliff because you can download the code and just carry on yourself. It's kind of nice. Building that same weather bot is kind of like a 10-minute task. I've done some screenshots rather than kind of build the whole thing out now, just again, time. But you can see you drag these parts on to get the user input, go and get the user input, put it in a variable, like right click, access external resource, like all the things that are quite common, including the hard things like auth and like all the login process and stuff like that. They've just like made little boxes of functionality that you can add on, and then they just reference them. They call them together nicely. The code is actually a really good way of figuring out how to do stuff in the bot framework. You can just like write a sample bot, do some things that roughly line up to what you want to do, and then download the code and see how they've done it. And that's a great way of using this tool as well. You can see here, send HTTP request. You just fill in the bits you need. It supports kind of function. It supports like dynamic like variables and stuff like that. It's pretty clever in what it does. It plays really nicely with Lewis as well. So you can do some really quite clever things using this. It GA'd, like I say, back in November. It's been previewed for about 3 or 4 months before that. So it's a relatively new tool, but I really like it. I think as a tool for those reasons I said. Really, it's a good place to start, but it's also a great place to learn. It's a good place to like jump off from as well. So so I thought that's kind of cool. The other thing, and you may be aware of this as well, Power Virtual Agents also announced at Ignite, meaning that Ignite was the place where they announced 2 visual UIs for building bots, but there you go. It's officially part of the Power Platform, so this is the one that gets the attention, I guess, gets the marketing. Power Virtual Agents, it's a UI for building bots. It's licensable, so you pay for it. So the bot framework you don't pay for as such. It's open source. You run it. Obviously, you're responsible for the Azure bits of the bot you build, but sort of that's it. Whereas this is licensed more as a service. This is pitched as a no-code solution. The superpower for me, I think, around Power Virtual Agents is that you can directly execute flows. So if you've already got flows set up, Power automates flows. I don't know. If you've already got them set up and you've built your business to use them and people understand them and people are building them, this is a great way of automating them. And you can publish direct to teams from here as well. Under the hood, they use a surprising amount of functionality that's similar. So what's really interesting is that if you do have a mix of citizen developers doing low-code solutions, but you also have a dev team, your dev team can do the hard bits as composable blocks in bot framework. So let's say you've got a horrible legacy system. Your dev team can write what are called skills. So skills are like the bit under the hood that both platforms, the language they both understand. Your dev team can build a skill using bot framework to interact with that horrible legacy system that your citizen developers can then directly access in Power Virtual Agents as a kind of third-party add-on skill. That makes it really interesting for bridging that gap around, where does the cliff come? What are the functionalities? What can I do? What can't I do? Am I building something that is too complicated? So that's a really nice demarc between the business side of development and the development side of development. So, okay, the third in our kind of high-level travel through the development landscape are the Microsoft Graph APIs. So I shall come back to this. So raise your hand if you've never used Graph Explorer, and I shall decide whether or not to show it to you, because if everyone's seen it, it's kind of pointless, right? So, but if no one's seen it, we should absolutely see it. These are the lifecycle APIs for Microsoft Graph. So this is fundamentally like, can you drive Microsoft Teams using Graph? And the answer is, for quite a lot of it, yes, you can. So you can do things like create teams, delete teams, manage the membership of teams, put stuff into teams, like add channels, all those sort of things. You can do all of that by what are called the transactional APIs. So like the gets, the puts, the deletes, all the rest of it, similar to all of the rest of Graph. So it's a similar permission model, it's the same app that you need and all the rest of it. There are some add-ons that make it more interesting. So resource-specific consent is a teams-only permission model, teams-only for the moment, permission model that's new in Azure, Azure AD, sorry. This gives very specific permission grants to team owners to do stuff. So a team owner can authorize things like, so let's look at channel creation and putting messages into channels in a team. If you want an application to have permissions to do that, traditionally, you need to give site-wide access to control all channels and all teams, because that's the level of the permission set that you get to with Azure AD. It's like, I can't remember what it is now, like teams.write.all or something. Yeah, that's kind of fine, but when you get into big organizations, you get wrapped up in red tape around IG and permissions and governance and security and all the rest of it. Actually, what you want your app to do is just do those things within the confines of the team. And the best person to say that's all right is the team owner. So resource-specific consent gives applications a mechanism for team owners to authorize things that applications can do within the bounds of the team that would otherwise be a bit of a pain to get through IT, basically. So that's interesting and worth looking into, because it can really unlock that blocker of, I've written this great app, but I now can't get IT to approve it. Change notifications, I'm going to talk about in a second, but they basically turn on head the idea of using the transactional APIs to get large amounts of data and like eliminate the need for polling. A couple of things to be aware of, and we're going to go through in a bit. Throttling, I'm going to go through in a bit because it's important. The beta endpoint, so there's a beta and a 1.0 of Graph. The beta endpoint changes relatively aggressively, so breaking changes happen to the beta, but also all the interesting stuff is on beta as well. So you just kind of have to kind of choose what it is you're trying to do. You're not supposed to use beta for anything that is production as well, because there's no support guarantees on it. Okay, should I do something around Graph Explorer, or should I not bother? Can somebody who can see any hands? Are there any hands for Graph Explorer?
There are no hands.
Perfect, good. I'm going to assume you know what you're doing. Good, that's good. Fine. Let's talk quickly about throttling. So this, if you write any kind of semi-serious application, you're going to come across this if you're gathering anything other than trivial amounts of data, because Graph has to protect itself. It's a service. It's a multi-tenanted, massive service. It has to do that kind of thing. It gets a bit complicated because Graph throttles, and then each individual service throttles as well underneath that. And each service has different limits. Some of them are published, some of them are not. And so it's a bit of a gamble. It's a bit of a game. But more or less, most of the time when throttling happens, you get a 429 response. And sometimes, depending on your workload, and SharePoint is really good at this, other workloads are not quite so good. Teams is getting better, but sometimes you get a retry after header. So the retry after header tells you how long you should wait before you make that request again. And if you get a retry after header, you should obey it, because if you don't obey it, then it won't work. And also you'll be counted negatively. It still counts for one of your usage limits. So if you get one, use one. But if you don't get one, then you have to sort of guess. So something like exponential backoff with a bit of random is a useful kind of metric to go by as well. Microsoft Teams specifically has published rate limits around throttling. So there's the link on the page there. They publish the rates at which you shouldn't exceed different workloads. And depending on what it is you're trying to get out of Teams, they will be different rate limits, which makes it even more confusing. And there are max limits, and there are limits across the tenant, there are limits across the app. So it gets quite complicated quite quickly. The other thing is we're seeing Microsoft take quite a hard line around what you should be using the transactional APIs for. You shouldn't be polling the data really. You shouldn't, like, if you're polling, you shouldn't do it more than once a day. You shouldn't like spam it, trying to just see if something's changed. If you can use deltas, you should. So some of the calls use delta tokens. So you can get data and then you get a token back, and then you supply that same token next time, and it will only give you data that's changed since that point. So that's really useful because it means you haven't got to worry about deduping quite so much. But it also makes the service, like, it's less load on the service because you're not getting the same data again and again and again. Yeah, so a note on throttling. There are some things you can do to kind of help as well. So this is across all of Graph. It's not specific to Teams, but you can batch stuff up. So you can make up to 20 requests inside one big Graph batch request, send that off and get all the results back in one big batch response. So that's quite good, although there's a big gotcha at the bottom. Get/Teams is like the thing you'd want to do, right? But it's not supported in batch, so you can't do that. But some of the other things you definitely can do, and you can see on screen on the picture, you can mix and match workloads as well, so you can get across a range of different things. And yeah, it's a more efficient way, I suppose, if you're getting lots of things or you're trying to get things in parallel. This is quite an efficient way of doing it. So if you are getting, like, if you do have an application, or you're thinking of writing an application that's going to get lots of data, so you want to get, you know, all the teams and all the channels and all the messages and do something wonderful with them, there are a couple of other things you could consider. And this is across all of Graph. It's not specific really to Teams. Data Connect is a thing. It's a way of getting large amounts of data out of Graph and into Azure Data Factory. Annoyingly, doesn't really support Teams. So there is sort of that, like, it depends, because I don't want to put it on here, but obviously you're looking at it and be like, well, Teams doesn't support it, what's the point? But actually, if you think about what Teams is, it's also, if you want to go to files, that's like, you know, that's interesting. Well, actually, I don't think files is supported either, but it's users and mail as well. So depending on your application, actually getting all the users, getting all the mail is part of maybe what your application is trying to do. So it's worth knowing it's there, and also it's worth keeping an eye on because these things are being added all the time as well. Delta queries I've talked about briefly already. There's a bit more detail there on doing them. I'm going to real-time respond to Kevin's question about batching, in that it feels a bit complicated to set up and get the data back. Sort of, like it should just work. There's a couple of gotchas that in practice are real pains. So if one part of the batch fails, so if you issue 10 requests and one of them fails, it's not immediately obvious when you get that back. Sometimes all 10 fail, like the whole batch fails because of it, or sometimes the whole batch succeeds and then you have to iterate through each one to figure it out. So it is a bit complicated. Also, like not every workload, the biggest problem actually is that not every workload supports batching, and it's not immediately obvious which do and which don't. So it's a bit of sort of trial and error to see. The error code you get back should tell you, but often they don't. So it is a bit fiddly. It feels like a nice idea that could do with a bit more work, if I'm being honest. So yeah, like I think look at them, consider them. If they work for you, that's great. If they don't, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Like yeah, if you do enough with throttling, Microsoft will come and have a word with you, and then you throw out your hands and say batching is really hard, and they'll help you out, and you can go down that path. But the other thing that's interesting is that it might all go away anyway, because what's kind of really interesting at the moment is change notifications, so the webhook mechanism. So completely different method and model of getting the data, where rather than polling all the time, you go to Microsoft and say, hey, you tell me when a new team gets added or when a new message goes into this team, and then Graph will ping you on your endpoint. So you register and say, like, call me on this endpoint that I've set up over here. And yeah, Graph will tell you when stuff happens. Much nicer than polling all the time. So and also has the added benefit, you can do serverless things. So you can, like Azure Functions are a perfect place to go and set up subscriptions, because then you only pay for them when they're being used and being called. And it's a nice public endpoint that's what Graph needs as well. So kind of easy to set up as well. You put a post into /subscriptions for the resource that you want. So here on the screen, I'm doing all Teams messages. There's a published set of expiry. Each workload has a different subscription expiry time, like token time. Of course they do. You can resubscribe within that window, but if you don't do anything, the subscription will just end. And there's a dance to go through on the very first time, because Graph will send that endpoint a validation token. You need to send it back basically within 10 seconds, which is a bit of a handshake, so everyone knows what's going on. And then Graph will start just sending you stuff as it happens. Obviously the body depends on what it is you're subscribing to, but you can kind of find out with a bit of trial and error, or it is all published in the documentation. And then that patch request at the bottom is the thing you need to do to renew a subscription before it expires, if you want to. Okay, I'm a bit conscious of time, but in the remaining few minutes, I'm going to talk about app templates, because they are another unsung hero I think that everyone should be using and know about. So, app templates. What if I told you they were a whole set of fully working apps written by Microsoft and the community that you can look at in a catalog, you can pick off, you can deploy into your Azure fairly easily. You don't need to be a developer to get them running. They come with detailed deployment documentation. They come with architecture documentation. They're built, they're fully open sourced, they're free. That's what app templates are. There's a whole list of these solutions that Microsoft has built to kind of answer some of the kind of key problems and concerns and like things that people want to do inside Teams. And new apps are being added all the time. And you don't need to be a developer to install them. And they're all open source. So if you are a developer, you can take them, you can brand them, you can like tweak them to fit what you need to do. If you just want to learn how they work, that's an absolutely valid and useful way to use app templates as well. I did a list, like if you go, you can go to aka/Teams app templates, which I've got a link in a minute, but you can go there and you'll see the list, and it looks a bit like the one on the right. It's not super interesting. I did like a more of a categorized list on that bit.ly link, where I'm just basically categorized them into like apps for productivity, apps for communication, apps for learning, Q&A apps, just because I don't think they get enough publicity, basically. Looking at an example real quick. So this is one that uses a messaging extension, just like I showed you right at the beginning, but it gets information from SharePoint lists, because everybody has data in SharePoint lists. So why not expose your SharePoint list as a quick and easy Microsoft messaging extension? That is an app that you can go to a link today, get running in your Azure as a thing, using this open source code from app templates. So super, super useful. There's a walkthrough video. It's on GitHub. It's super easy to set up. There's loads of apps like these. They're really kind of pretty impressive. They all come looking like this, with like a place in GitHub, which probably scares most people if you're not big into the development side, because it already looks like crazy code. But bear with it, because they all have these 3 links at the bottom. They all have documentation, deployment, and architecture. The documentation stuff just kind of walks you through like how to install it, and you don't need to be a developer. You just need to follow the instructions. And they all come with a nice solution overview as well, if you need to give them to IT or just understand what is going on. Super specific question actually about FAQ Plus supporting multi-term responses. I think it does, actually. I think the latest version of FAQ Plus does support multi-turn responses. If we chat after this, I know exactly where to go to look it up, so I'll try and give you a better answer than that, but I think it does. The bit.ly was bit.ly/Teams app templates. Cool. So, all right. Bringing it all together, wrapping it up, whatever you want to call it. There's a load of things you can do. There's a load of different ways in which you can approach kind of building apps on Teams. I put a load of links on there. There are different areas you can go to. Obviously, you can combine all of these. I just wanted to break them up so that you could see where to go to solve different problems and to get different pieces of information, because otherwise it can feel like a big like mess of stuff and it's kind of hard to know where to go. There's a big landing place at the bottom, developer.microsoft.com/Microsoft Teams. That is a good place to get started if you just want like a front door into doing kind of Teams development. The other links, I've put links to all the things I think I've spoken about more or less. There's some things I haven't spoken about, like cognitive services and Q&A maker, but yeah, I think it's super useful. This I've thrown in right at the end, so I think I can talk about this, but I don't really know. But like, I'm sure it'll be fine. This hasn't been approved yet, so I did an interview. No one else knows this yet, so I did an interview with Mary Jo Foley yesterday around Inspire, and it's not been approved by Microsoft yet, so I can't put it out and I can't show you the video. But I feel pretty safe pulling this bit of the conversation out. So, talking about Inspire, which is Microsoft's partner conference. If you're a partner today, where would you be focused? Where are the gaps? If you look at where Microsoft is really beating the drum right now, Teams is the obvious one. If you can find any way to add value around Teams, that's what I would be focusing heavily on. So a bit of an endorsement there from Mary Jo Foley. My takeaway is you should absolutely like look at this. I think it's really interesting. Build stuff for users, because it keeps them inside Teams, it keeps them productive, it keeps them empowered. Bringing that information to users and surfacing it feels like a really big win. Thanks very much. That was a bit of a monologue.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was really, really interesting. Yeah,
thanks for that. Nice one.
Is there anybody got any questions?
Yeah, I'm gonna have a look at that bit.ly now, because I've probably just mistyped it. It's really, they're capitalized specific, I think, as well, bit.lys, aren't they? Someone was saying it's not working. So it should be.
I think they need to be capitalized, Tom.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, that bit.ly does work, but it's capital specific.
Yeah.
These are just like I've just grouped up like all the different apps, because I think it's just easier to see them than it is on the GitHub page. So that's what that was.
We've got a great question from Akash in the WhatsApp group. For getting started with Teams development, do you recommend Yo Teams Generator or the Teams VS Toolkit? And I'm really interested in this as well because it's the development where it's kind of landscape is a bit fractured.
Yeah.
Should we say?
Yeah, and I suppose that it's hard not to give a consulting it depends answer, right? For me, I prefer the VS Toolkit, but I've come from a .NET background, like a middleware background, databases, Win32 apps, come into that space. I've done some web stuff, but I haven't done web first. I think maybe if you come, it depends where you've come from, right? If you come in on that web side, if you've come in via Node or places like that, if you're super familiar with Yeoman, you'll probably prefer like the Yo Teams generator. Fundamentally, I think they're trying to do the same thing in providing scaffolding. And so it sort of almost doesn't matter. Use whichever one you prefer. Maybe if you've never heard of, like, if Yo Teams does not sound like a, if your initial, when you heard that, was like, this is not a, generation tool, this is kid speak, then maybe stick with the VS Code one. I don't know. If you're already familiar with Yeoman, then there's no reason not to use it. Yeah. I don't tend to demo it because I'm not super familiar with it. Yeah, that's the only reason, really.
I think the distinction at the moment is the toolkit is from Microsoft. The Yo Teams is its community. So Yo Teams is PMP backed, so that's Victor Villain. So that's community kind of built and maintained. But then you've also got SharePoint Framework, I guess.
Yeah,
I
would say actually in some ways like the Yo Team stuff is a bit more fully featured because it's community driven. It's it works on probably a faster iteration loop than the VS Code one does. But it also it's really hard. It does really depend because like if you want something that's slow moving and a bit like corporate backed, then the Microsoft Toolkit is probably the answer because then you can point that to any IT team and be like, look, it's built by Microsoft, it's fine, and you've got less hoops to jump through.
Right. Well, any more questions? Have you had any? We've just been chatting about this data flex, and have you had any sort of look into that at all, Tom?
No, actually, if I'm honest, no, I heard about it just now, mostly because I've been a bit heads down today and yesterday, and I haven't sort of had a chance to see it. It's interesting, like, so it's another example of Microsoft trying to get more and more developers onto the Teams development platform. Like where can we, and SharePoint developers are a massive body of like super smart people building applications for organizations. Like it's another place Microsoft want to get everybody like lined up in the same place and pointing in the same direction. So like anything like this, I'm not surprised. Like it's interesting. Yeah.
The data flex, I think at first was, it's a rename, but actually the dust has settled a little bit. There's a few articles that have come out, and it's not just a rename. It's pretty much something that will change the landscape because it's now effectively a relational database living inside Microsoft Teams based on the CDS. So now, rather than thinking, do I go full-blown CDS or do I use SharePoint lists? Now there's this element in the middle where actually you can just put everything into Teams. And that's a really great story, because I know one of the problems that there is in Teams development is when you're starting to get into storing settings for tabs and things like that, there's not an obvious place for that data to go. A lot of people have said use Azure Storage or even a SharePoint list, but for ISVs, that becomes difficult as well, because it's another thing you've got to handle. Whereas now, if there's a central place where every customer's potentially going to have that data flex layer, then it becomes a much easier place to store settings and things like that. In fact, there was one other option. I didn't even know this was possible, but you can use OneDrive to store personal user settings as well. There's a blog post by Waldeck Mastercars every SharePoint framework app, I think, has this element to store user properties within your own OneDrives. And that was another way of doing it, but it didn't seem right. It was the right place to store it, but it seemed an odd place to do it. But Dataflex does seem like it's going to be, well, very interesting going forwards, I think.
Especially the licensing. If it's included with your license, then that's.
I think that's the big deal. It's the licensing.
Yeah.
The licensing stuff suddenly opens up the prospect of doing proper database stuff within teams, rather than cludging or going, we can't do it because CDS is too expensive as a standalone.
Yeah.
Can Gary and Simon, are we allowed to plug things, or am I going to get in trouble if I do that?
You can plug
Depends
stuff
what you're
as long as it's appropriate.
So I know Gary's talked about Grey Hat Beard. We've got Chris Hunting from Microsoft, which was scheduled about 2.5 weeks ago before we knew anything about Dataflex, and he's going to be on this weekend talking about Power Platform licensing. So if anyone has any questions about it, send it over to us on Twitter, and we'll make sure we ask him and try and cover that in the show.
I believe on Twitter, Nigel Price is already engaging him.
We've lined Nigel up as a special guest.
Yeah. We were going to just drop him in on Chris last minute and see what he said.
I think he's already got him.
I'm always interested in knowing what the limits on these things are. It's great to have the capability, but where are the constraints? Those are the first. It's like when you're riding a car, the first thing you need to learn is the brakes. So I want to know that. Once we've got that, we can then start to work out where we can really apply it in the real world.
Would there be a 5,000 item limit?
Yeah.
I think this is really interesting though, because recently on Twitter, Mark Anderson was talking about how licensing is making you design bad solutions. And it's a valid point in that we're trying to skirt around things. CDS has its benefits. Yes, it has some costs, but there's some real benefits there to organizations. But, the alternative is, well, I'm going to put it in SharePoint, which we all know is not a relational database. And it has its own pitfalls as well. So having, I think, recognizing that that's a gap and then looking to fill that is always a good thing. So I think obviously things will come out in the wash, but it's definitely a step in the right direction for me.
Definitely. I think there'll be some interesting questions about where the data lives, like who can access it, like all that kind of stuff. It's really hard because, like, in some ways you might say, well, this is not a big organization solution, but actually it sort of is, because those are exactly the ones that have the systems developers solving it. This is directly to solve that problem of I've hit the cliff because now I need to store some stuff, and suddenly it got really hard with a million connectors I don't understand and a lot of decisions I have to make about storage, right? So I see IT teams being interested in this, like in from that respect as well.
What makes you think it's not a big organization system? Because it certainly scales. I suppose.
I think
it
absolutely will be. No. I think it absolutely. Like my initial.
Okay.
My initial thought there was like, surely this isn't for people who worry about IG and where data is stored, but I 100% think that will be the case. Yeah.
I think it's a nice, because I think people have worried about CDS, that they have to go all in with CDS, and if they want to try things out, see if it works, it's quite an expensive way to get started. This, to me, feels like a way to get into that and then go into the full enterprise. Let's justify that cost. And I felt it's been needed for a while, so it feels like a really good step. I think the only thing that worried me slightly was that the kind of comments about SharePoint developers and saying, you won't be developing stuff with SharePoint for Teams anymore. So all those kind of team solutions in SPFX and stuff like that seem to be automatically pushed to second-class citizens. Be interesting to see what happens with that.
Yeah.
I think it's it's a combination of the two, isn't it? SharePoint's strength is its developer kind of. I was going to say developer friendly then, but no, that's just talking rubbish. There's lots of SharePoint developers out there. There's been a huge increase in the use of SharePoint framework over the last few years. It's a proven development platform, if you like, for SharePoint. So using that, not reinventing the wheel again in Teams and having another development model is bringing that through. That's the SharePoint side of it, definitely. that's coming through. The data storage part, I'm quite happy to leave SharePoint lists alone. So I'm, using something that's a bit more, well, a real data source.
I'm sure there'll be a
is
data
good.
flex PMP like initiative, won't there? So
most likely, if there's room for one, then I'm sure someone will be happy to take that on. So yeah, but like I say, this is what usually happens.
That's interesting because there's nothing like that as far as I know for CDS really.
No.
Particularly, maybe I've just not heard about it, but
no, I don't think there is there? No. I wonder if that's how possible that is, because that would open up some doors, wouldn't it? Then
these Dynamics folks, they love just towing their line far too much. You come to SharePoint, everyone's trying to break it and go different ways around. Dynamics, everyone behaves nicely.
Like the British gentlemen, are they?
On the subject of PMP, though, just before we started, there is a conference that's been announced. So PNP are running their own conference, and it is on the 1st of September. So there's registrations that have gone out today. So I'd look out for probably lots of SharePoint framework development and Teams development, PMP, you name it, will be covered.
We might have to move our user group from the 1st of September to the subsequent weekend. It could be
it's live stream. Yeah.
It's during the day, so you can still fit it in. It's 12 till 6:30, so it's a good time as well. It's not 3 o'clock in the morning.
Perfect. People can roll straight from PMP straight into PM user group. I bet they'd love to do that.
Exactly. Yeah. We'll just turn it into a PMP conference after show, right?
Yeah, exactly. Sounds good. Yeah.
PowerPoint.
Just have to put power in. Oh, flex pint. No, that doesn't work.
Right. So I'm going to have to shoot off. I can hear the kids need some bit of putting into bed now. So, but Tom, thank you very much for your time.
No worries. Thank you, everyone.
Brilliant to sort of get involved and do that session. Really enjoyed it. A lot of food for thought. I've been thinking that I need to get more into Teams, and then this data flex bit as well is just so there's a few too many subtle hints, I think, really, that Teams is the next step.
Yeah, this data flex thing is gonna I think gonna be really interesting to I've got some blog posts, right? Yeah.
There's a good blog post by Andrew Welsh, Runway View, I think it was. I was reading that one. He's got a good kind of a good understanding, really, of, I guess, where it's being positioned and how big a change it is. So,
nice.
So that's good.
Thank you.
All right, take care all. We'll see you on
Simon.
the 4th of August, hopefully. All right, cheers. Bye bye.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye.
Bye bye, everyone.